What is the purpose of a prologue? Well, it literally means the words before. So it's the words that come before the rest of the words, which is very descriptive. But typically the purpose of a prologue is to, in some sense, set up what's coming next. And in today's talk, I want to talk about the two primary purposes of John's prologue in two categories, the literary and theological purposes. So there's a lot that could be said about this. I have not nearly enough time to unpack the prologue to the Gospel of John. There's so much going on in there, as you just saw. There's so much rich theology and philosophy in these 18 verses. And I can't cover all of it, but all I want to talk about today in particular is the literary and theological roles that this prologue plays in setting up the rest of the Gospel of John. And as I mentioned earlier, seniors just memorized this prologue because in Faith and Culture, which is a class that I teach, it's a senior capstone class, and we spend the entire first month and a half of the year in the Gospel of John. We actually just finished today with the end of our unit in John in mid-October. We spent a lot of time there because there's a lot there, and even then we can't even begin to cover the half of it. And the prologue itself is just so rich and has so much going on that I'm going to do my best today to talk about what it is and why it's significant. The first thing I want to do is just talk about the prologue to John in comparison to other gospel prologues. So there are 4 gospels, right? You got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Each of them takes a unique approach to introducing the subject of the gospel, and the subject, of course, being Jesus. The gospels are biographies of Jesus, so they're telling about Jesus, which means it matters how they start. How does each of these gospel writers try to introduce us to the person of Jesus, which is such a big thing to introduce? And they all have their own approach. Matthew very famously starts with the genealogy of Jesus. So his first thing is to say, this Jesus that I'm about to tell you about, he's the one who comes from David, who comes from Abraham, who comes from Adam. He's the fulfillment of this promise, the fulfillment of this expectation. He's bridging us back to the Old Testament. That's how Matthew starts. Mark's gospel starts off with a very short little prologue that is a testimony from John the Baptist, similar to what you see in the Gospel of John. But Mark even jumps in even more abruptly. In verse 1 of the first chapter of Mark, he simply says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Just right out the gate, he says, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, and then he tells you what John has to say. And these first few verses are John's testimony about Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark moves very quickly. His gospel is the earliest and the shortest. He says immediately, like 1,000 times. He gets right into it. Luke gives his own little prologue in 4 verses, and you get the personality and flavor of Luke in that prologue. He starts off by telling you who he is and why he's writing, and to whom he's writing. He says, Theophilus, the lover of God to whom he is writing, it has come to my attention that many have undertaken to write up an account of the things that have occurred among us. Many have tried to write this stuff down. And he says, I have decided that I ought to bring together the sources, bring together the witnesses, and present to you the most orderly account that I could. The best historical perspective on the person of Jesus Christ. That's how Luke introduces himself. What about John? John starts the story of Jesus with the beginning of time. He starts off not his ancestry, not John the Baptist and his baptism, the beginning of his ministry, not his birth narrative in Luke. He starts with in the beginning. And it is inevitable that any Jewish audience is going to immediately think of another very famous in the beginning. That being Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. John knows that's what you're going to think. How could you not? And that's what he wants. He wants to orient his story about Jesus at the beginning of time. And that's going to be a big deal because throughout the Gospel of John, one of the ongoing themes is the question of where did Jesus come from? That's a question that gets asked a lot. Where is this guy from? It comes up practically. People will say, hey, isn't this guy from Nazareth? I didn't think that the Messiah was supposed to come from Nazareth. And there's a little bit of tension about that. There's even a moment where somebody specifically says, I thought the Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem. And they don't know that he was born in Bethlehem. But Jesus consistently says, that's not where I'm from. Where I'm from is the Father. That's where I'm from. And this question of Jesus' fromness, where he comes from, is a big deal throughout John. And so at the beginning, he immediately tells you, this Jesus guy, he is from the beginning. And it's the same thing that John then testifies later in the prologue. This guy who comes after me, he was actually before me. This is where he's from. He's from the beginning. So what I want to do is start by unpacking the literary and theological purposes just a little bit, with just a couple quotations that I like a lot. So this first quotation, he, the reader, cannot yet fully understand the motifs in the prologue, but they are half comprehensible, half mysterious. They arouse the tension and awaken the question, which is essential if he is to understand what is going to be said. So literarily, in other words, in terms of the structure of this as a book, as a piece of literature, what the prologue does is it teases you. It gives you like a little bit, and it leaves you wondering what's coming. On the one hand, John's prologue is the most explicitly revelatory of any of the Gospels. He says it right out. The Word was God. It seems like he's really getting to the point. But on the other hand, it's also the most mysterious. It's theological, it's philosophical, he's using big words. So there's this element of he's coming right out and saying it, but he's also kind of not. And you need to read the rest of the book. So our first discussion in this faith and culture class in my section, our discussion of this chapter was literally just, who is Jesus? Because that's the question he wants you to be asking. Who is this guy? He gives you a lot of descriptors for him, gives you a lot of titles for him, but he leaves you with a big unanswered question, right? Who is this guy for real? So that's the literary function of the prologue. It kind of tees up what's coming and gets you interested, hooks you with a question, and then keeps you going. Theologically, there's a little more to it. The prologue, this is D.A. Carson, the prologue summarizes how the Word, which was with God in the very beginning, came into the sphere of time, history, tangibility. In other words, how the Son of God was sent into the world to become the Jesus of history so that the glory and grace of God might be uniquely and perfectly disclosed. The rest of the book is nothing other than an expansion of this theme. I love the way he puts that. The rest of the book is nothing other than an expansion of this theme. So literarily, the prologue is just a tease. But theologically, the prologue encapsulates everything that is to come. So even though it's not enough on its own, even though it's very much designed to push you into the rest of the book with questions that need answering, it also kind of gets all the important stuff out there right out the gate. The Word became flesh, dwelt among us, we've seen His glory, the glory of the only Son from the Father. The true light has come into the world. That's the big message, and that message is just going to get reiterated and expanded and debated throughout the whole rest of the gospel. So the natural place to start from here is I pretty much the rest of today just want to talk about the Word. The word, and why it's an important word, and why it's in here. Because it's rather conspicuous. So that's where I want us to start, introducing the Word. So I had to be that guy and put a little Greek up here because it looks cool. That's the bottom line. Greek looks cool. So I did go ahead and put the Greek on the back here because I think it's just of value to see what it looks like. This first line here, in the beginning was the Word. En arche ein ho logos, kai ho logos ein proston theon, kai theos ein ho logos. That just says this. It's not magical. But here's what's interesting about it. This word, is just as funky in Greek as it is in English. You see that there, and it raises questions. Why is he talking about the Word? And here's what I want you to know. There is a lot of theological and philosophical history behind this word that you can unpack. And you can go, okay, what would a Jewish audience be thinking of when they see the Logos? What would a Greek audience be thinking of when they see the Logos? And those are good questions. Those are not the wrong question to ask. But also, that skips a step. The first step is, what do you see when you see the word word? And the answer is word. Like, you know what a word is? It's not magic. What is a word? What does a word do? A word is just, simply put, a thought, but outside your head. You have your thoughts in here, you put them out here, that's a word. And a word is a funny thing, because the word simultaneously is my thought, it is what's going on in my brain as I'm saying it, but it's also not in here anymore. It's out here, where you can hear it. That's what a word does. And so when we ask the question, what is this logos, what is this word, I think it's a little hasty to jump to the ancient context, as much as that makes sense, before we just ask, what is a word? And what a word is it's the mind outside the mind. It's the mind in the world. That's, I think, the first key to unlocking what John is doing here. Before we get into the Greek and the Hebrew context, which are relevant, it's just important to know what a word is. Because that's the first thing that's going to come to mind. Your thoughts, but out here. So, before I expand on that theme, I will take a brief moment to talk a little bit about the proposals for its conceptual background. And I just want to acknowledge, I know this looks funky, semicolons are how you write a question mark in Greek, fun fact. So that is a question mark. It just looks dumb when I put an English question mark next to a Greek word, so I went with that. So, I'm going to read this to you. A quote from Stephen Kim. Proposals for its, that is logos, conceptual background can be broadly classified into three sources. A, Greek philosophy, coming from Stoicism and Philo, among others. The word as the personification of wisdom in Jewish wisdom literature, Sophia. And the Word of God in the Old Testament. So there's three primary contexts. The first one is the Greek context. The word logos in Greek philosophy, especially among the Stoics, Philo is like a Jewish Greek philosopher. That word has come at this point in history to mean like the logical, rational principle, the mind behind the universe. Because the Greeks believed that the universe was a very orderly, rational thing. And so naturally they assumed that at the back of the universe there is some kind of organizing, rational, logical principle. They weren't wrong about that. Turns out to be a bit more personal, but they weren't wrong. There is this rational, logical, organizing principle in the form of a mind at the back of the cosmos. The second is the word as the personification of wisdom in Jewish wisdom literature. If you've ever read the book of Proverbs, then you've read Jewish wisdom literature. And you know that wisdom is given personality. She stands on the street corner and she calls out to people and she says, "Listen to me. I'm not hiding. I'm right here. Come listen to my words." And there's actually a passage in the Proverbs where it says that wisdom, speaking personified, says, "I was the first of his works. I was at the beginning." So there's this idea that the wisdom of God is itself a personified thing. So perhaps the Word is the wisdom of God as a personified thing. That's also not incorrect. We see in John's prologue that the Word is with God, is the creative force of God in the beginning, organizing, rationalizing creation. So that's also true. The third, and I think probably the most obvious, is just the role of the Word of God in the Old Testament. Why do I think that's the most obvious? Because of John's first three words, in the beginning. What are you now thinking of? You're thinking of Genesis 1. What does the Word do in Genesis 1? Creates everything. The very next few verses, God says, "Let there be light." He says, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters." He says, "Let there be dry land." He says, "Let there be birds and flowers," and those things are. So because of the context that John has already set up for you, in psychological speak we call this priming. He has primed you to think about Genesis, and then he says the Word. So now you're thinking of the Word in Genesis, you're thinking of God's creative power. And then he goes ahead and clarifies that that is in fact what he means when he says, "He was in the beginning with God, all things were made or created through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." So he explicitly says you're on the right track when you think about the Word in creation. That's what I'm talking about. That doesn't mean he isn't talking about these other things, but at the very least he is talking about that. So the common thread between all of these is that the Word is about communication, and here in particular, divine communication from God to creation. The rational, logical principle of God at work in creation. The personification of God's wisdom at work in creation. The Word of God that creates by its power and will. That's what the Word is. The graphic that I like to use, and that I've used with students, is this right here. It's kind of a freaky looking graphic, but bear with me. This is the mind, and you'll notice that it's coterminous with these words. These words are what's in here, but they're out here. To me, that is the best way to communicate what it means to talk about the Word of God at work in the world. It is helpful to imagine words as the external manifestation of one's own interiority. In other words, your words are your thoughts as they exist outside of your own head. In much the same way, the Logos of God can be understood as God's own mind made manifest outside of himself and inside the realm of his creation. Now, obviously, this gets more complicated when we get into Trinitarian theology and the interplay within the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. But right now, all John wants you to understand is that he's talking about the very Word of God, the wisdom, the mind of God, through which all things were created. And then he's going to do this insane thing where he claims that that very Word, that very mind of God, has got a body. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Before we get there, I just want to show you this list. This is something that we taught to students in Faith and Culture. This is a list that Packer draws out of 7 things we see the Word doing, or we learn about the Word, in just these first 18 verses. So what do we see? We see that the Word has eternity. The Word is eternal. In the beginning was the Word. So the Word is not new. Second thing we see is that the Word is personal. The Word was with God, meaning the Word is a He. He's got this entity. He's with God. He isn't the same exact thing. There's a withness, so there's somehow two here. You can't have with if there's not two, right? I'm not with myself. I'm just myself. There's with here. There's personality. Then you go further, and there's also deity. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's a heck of an assertion. So we've got, within one verse, eternity, personality, and deity. He keeps going. The Word is creating. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. The Word is animating. That means producing life. In Him was life. The Word is revealing, and that life was the light of men, illuminating, somehow bringing, revealing, bringing knowledge, bringing light. That life was the light of men. All of this is already gnarly. But then John, he kind of puts things on pause for a little while. He lets you simmer with all this for a bit. He talks about John the Baptist for a little while. But then he comes back and he hits us with this one. Incarnate. That's where the skeleton comes in handy. Now he's going to make the claim in verse 14, the pinnacle of this whole thing, the crowning achievement of the prologue, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth, which if you haven't noticed is on the Pacifica crest. Grace and truth. That's what He was full of. That's what the Word brings. This is the part where the whole thing gets scandalous. This is where he's blown the top off it. Up to this point, we've been kind of tracking. It's like standard theology, philosophy, mumbo jumbo. Now John's like, no, I'm talking about that guy over there with the legs and arms and a head and hair, and he has to use the bathroom. That guy. That's the Word. That is the eternal, manifest mind of God, His wisdom made manifest in His creation through which all things were created. He's a dude now, walking around. That's what makes the whole gospel so insane. That's the part that's offensive. That's the part that's confusing. And it's confusing to all of the people groups to whom this is written. All right? It's confusing to the Greeks, because the Greeks like to think that the body is bad and the immaterial stuff is good. Plato was real big on that. And so all of the various Greek schools of thought, they disagree on a lot, but most of them, not all of them, most of them generally think that the immaterial stuff is better than the material stuff. So to claim that the very reasoning, logical principle behind the universe has a body now, that's just rude, right? Then you've got the Jews, all right? The Jews have a lot of important rules, they have a lot of important laws, but one of the most important ones is that God doesn't have an image. It's not how their God works. That's why everybody thinks it's weird about them. That their God is immaterial. That's funky, right? Most gods, they've got a rock, they've got an idol, they got a tree, they got something. The Israelites aren't supposed to have any of those things. Second commandment, right? You should not make for yourself an idol. So to then claim that God is a person is like the ultimate form of an image, right? I mean, that's what the body originally was. It's created in the image of God. So this is an image. This is God as an image. That's questionable, right? And then on top of that, the other big thing is John has simultaneously claimed that the Word is God, but also is with God. So that's sketchy, because he's not just talking about God, he's talking about some kind of a plurality within God. So now we're getting to some scary territory. And John knows that. He knows what he's doing. So that brings us to the scandal of incarnation. Although both Jewish and Hellenistic audiences of John's Gospel would likely have been somewhat comfortable and familiar with the concept of the Logos, both groups would have been stunned and scandalized by the climax of John's claim in verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It is precisely this claim about the Word that makes John's prologue a deeply revolutionary theological claim. So here's what I want you to get from this whole thing. All right, I could talk about this for a really long time. I think it's really fun. I'd like to read it in Greek. I think that'd be cool. It sounds fun and old-timey. But at the end of the day, here's the most important thing. When we look at John's prologue, the scandal of the incarnation is that it sounds crazy, but it also makes sense. How could the very principle of God's communication with His creation, remember the Word by definition already is the mind of God at work in the world. How could that be more perfectly finished than in an embodied, incarnate form? for God to truly walk on the earth, so that later the author of Hebrews can say that we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. He's been tempted exactly as we have. He has lived among us, dwelt among us. So yeah, it sounds crazy, and it kind of is crazy, but it also makes perfect, wonderful sense. That the fullest way God could communicate himself, which is what the Word has always been doing, the fullest way that God could take himself and put himself in creation would be to live, walk, breathe human life in creation. And that's what he does. That's what the Word does. And to me, that is the fascinating, incredible thing about the gospel, and especially about the way John lays it out for us, is that it is simultaneously so startling and surprising, and also, once it happens, it makes perfect sense. Nobody would have seen it coming, but when it happens and you look back, you go, oh wow, that is such a perfect fit. That is what God would do. That is what the Word would do. That he would become flesh. That he would walk and live among us so that we can see his glory. The glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And it continues from there. John re-emphasizes, you got the witness of John, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. John is now emphasizing this double origin thing, which becomes important in Jesus' ministry, that he's from two places. He's from Nazareth, he's from Bethlehem, he's from the womb of Mary, and he is also from the beginning with the Father creating all things. He is from both of those things. So John can say he comes after me, but he also came before me. Those are both true. This double origin of Jesus becomes a major theme throughout the Gospel of John. And then we get this contrast with Moses. This is going to happen throughout the rest of the Gospel of John. Jesus as the fulfillment, the perfect revelation of God. What was Moses' role? In the mind of the Israelites, in the mind of the Hebrews, Moses is the most prophet-y prophet. He did the most to communicate God to the people. He went up on Mount Sinai, he saw the back of God, he came back with his face glowing, and God's finger wrote it on the tablets. That's as close to the Word of God as they've had. And Jesus shows up and very intentionally becomes the perfect Moses. Moses, in order to prove himself as a messenger from God, had to perform 10 signs, 10 plagues in Israel. And the first of those plagues was that he turned water to blood as a sign of judgment. Jesus comes and he performs 7 signs, the number of completion and creation and fulfillment. And what's his first sign? He turns water to wine. It's time to party. He's bringing celebration. He's bringing life, right? Moses in the wilderness prayed and God sent manna, bread that they could eat. But they had to eat it every day. It had to keep coming. Jesus in John chapter 6 says, I am the bread of life. God gives me for the life of the world in the same way he gave manna for the life of Israel. All throughout this gospel, Jesus emphasizes that he is the new, the perfect, the fulfillment of God communicating with his people. God's been doing that for a long time. The Word has been around, but now the Word is here, like here in the flesh. And that's an incredible, incredible thing. Now, obviously, I don't have time to get through the rest of the Gospel of John with you. I wish I did, but I just spent a month and a half on it with your students, and we're still, I had to miss, most of it. So my encouragement to you is, go read it again. Read the Gospel. It's not that long, all right? It's a whole lot shorter than Hamlet. I love Hamlet, but yeah, I'm just saying, read them both. But my challenge here is read the Gospel of John with this in mind, because I think we often neglect the extent to which this prologue encapsulates and sets the table for everything that comes after. And now that we have this frame of mind where we're expecting to see the fulfillment of all of God's trends of communication, the way he has shown himself to his people, now in the most perfect, fulfilled form, Jesus in the flesh, now that you're seeing that and you read the Gospel of John, you're just going to see it popping up over and over again. The questions about where Jesus is from and his origin being answered. Jesus as the perfect Moses being demonstrated. So this brings us to beyond the prologue. It is important to remember that John's prologue does not stand alone. It exists to tee up the reader for what is to follow, the witness and testimony to Jesus and his divine identity found in his signs, his own words, the attestation of the Father and the Spirit, and the testimony of many human witnesses who interacted with the Word made flesh during his years of ministry. These two words are major themes in the Gospel of John. He repeatedly talks about witness, testimony. Why? Because he knows the claim he made in the prologue requires some evidence. He knows he made a big, big statement. And so for the rest of the book, people are constantly going to say, where is your evidence? Where is your witness? Where is your testimony? This is intentionally legal language. And the rest of the book effectively serves to make the case. The debate coach around here, they're giving their evidence, they're making their case to say, that stuff I said at the beginning is true, and you should believe it. And then John explicitly ends his book by telling you that's what he was doing. The end of the Gospel of John is a statement of purpose. John chapter 20, he says, this gospel was only scratching the surface of the things that Jesus did. Books could have been written about the other signs he did. But he says, I wrote this that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So he tees it up in the prologue and he says, here's who this guy is. I know it sounds crazy, but when you think about it, it really fits. And then he says, track with me, let me show you. There's the signs, there's the evidence, there's the witnesses, there's the testimony. And at the end of the book, he says, I wrote this so that you may believe, have justified belief. You're not just making it up. And that by believing, you may have life in his name. I'll wrap up with this verse from John chapter 3. Jesus explicitly puts this on the table to Nicodemus because Jesus entering the world has fundamentally altered the paradigm of what it means to know God and not to know God. All right, it's not about the law. It's not about doing things right. It's about when you're confronted with the word, do you listen or do you not? Do you step into the light or do you run back into the darkness? How do you respond to the incarnation that now becomes the single most important thing about you for all of time? And Jesus laid it right on the line in verse 19. This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. This is the judgment. So the way Jesus lands the plane is very simple. He's saying that the whole source of judgment now is not, are you a good person? Did you do it right? Did you obey the law? The source of judgment is simply when the light came into the world, did you shrink from it or step into it? When the word came into the world, did you listen to it or did you close your ears? And that's the whole paradigm. That's the whole thing. And that is the Gospel of John. Thank you.